At the dinner, nobody understood the German investor, until the cleaning lady's daughter started translating. The restaurant Le Chateau was shining like never before that Thursday. Crystal chandeliers reflected golden light onto impeccably set tables. In the private room, 6 men in dark suits adjusted their ties and checked their watches every minute, exchanging nervous glances. Charles Spencer, or Charlie as his closest friends called him, walked between the tables with firm steps, but his rigid face betrayed his tension. At 42, the owner of Spencer Investments was known for his calculated coldness. That night, however, it was impossible to hide his concern. "Kurt arrives in 20 minutes, announced Henry, his assistant, approaching with his phone in hand. The car just left the hotel. Charles simply nodded, running a hand through the graying hair at his temples. "And the interpreter?" "Still hasn't confirmed. We've been trying to reach him since 4. His cell goes straight to voicemail." Charles closed his eyes for a moment. The deal with Kurt Weissmann, one of Germany's biggest investors, was the salvation of Spencer Investments after 2 years of below-expected results. $67 million were on the line, and Weissmann was known for speaking exclusively in German during negotiations, a tactic to observe how potential partners handled pressure. "Keep trying," Charles ordered, keeping his voice low, "and prepare a plan B. See if any nearby restaurant has someone who speaks German." Henry nodded and quickly walked away, sweat glistening on his forehead. Charles adjusted the navy blue tie chosen especially for the occasion, a color that conveyed confidence, according to his image consultant. At the other end of the room, far from the executive's gazes, Elena Kowalski discreetly cleaned a small wine spill. At 34, the cleaning lady at Le Chateau worked in silence, moving like a shadow among the patrons. Her simple gray uniform contrasted with the elegance of the environment, but she was used to being practically invisible. Beside her, sitting on a stool in the most discreet corner of the room, Clara watched everything with attentive blue eyes. The 6-year-old girl, with blonde hair in 2 braids, held a children's book on her lap, but her attention was completely focused on the restaurant's buzz. "Mommy, why is that man walking in circles?" she whispered, pointing at Charles. "Shh, Clara." "Don't point," Elena corrected gently. "Remember what we agreed. Stay quiet until my shift is over." Clara nodded, looking back at her book. It wasn't common for Elena to bring her daughter to work, but the babysitter had cancelled at the last minute, and she couldn't afford to miss a day. Not with rent overdue and her father's medicine to buy. The restaurant manager, Mr. Moretti, had allowed Clara to stay, as long as she remained inconspicuous and didn't bother the customers. So far, the girl was holding up her end of the bargain perfectly, occasionally looking up to admire the elegant dresses and impeccable suits of the guests. At the restaurant's entrance, a quiet commotion began to form. Kurt Weissmann had arrived 15 minutes early. The German, a burly man of about 60 with perfectly combed white hair, entered the establishment accompanied by 2 equally serious aides. Charles moved forward to greet him, with a rehearsed smile and a confident posture that didn't reveal his internal chaos. "Herr Weissmann, willkommen," he greeted with one of the few German phrases he had memorized. The investor gave a brief nod, replying with something in fast, fluent German that made Charles's smile falter. Maintaining his composure, he guided the group to the main table while casting desperate glances at Henry, who shook his head negatively. Still no news from the interpreter. The tension was palpable. The Spencer executives looked at each other, uncertain. The interpreter's absence was not just an inconvenience, but a potential catastrophe. No one on the team spoke German beyond basic phrases, and Weissmann, as expected, continued to speak exclusively in his native tongue. "Gentlemen, please have a seat," Charles invited, gesturing to the chairs. Weissmann took his seat, observing everything with an analytical gaze. The sommelier approached to serve the wine, a German Riesling specially selected for the occasion, while Charles desperately searched for a solution. Perhaps they could use a translation app, but it would be a breach of protocol and show a lack of preparation. Was ist los? Gibt es ein Problem mit dem Dolmetscher? Weissmann asked, noticing the nervous glances. Charles smiled awkwardly, not understanding the question. The embarrassing silence stretched for seconds that felt like hours. One of the Spencer executives tried to intervene with a meaningless "ja, ja," making the situation worse. That's when a clear, childish voice came from the corner of the room. He's asking if there's a problem with the interpreter. All heads turned to Clara, who was now standing next to her stool, still holding her children's book. Eleanor went pale, dropping her cleaning cloth. "Clara!" she whispered in a reprimanding tone. Charles stared at the girl, initially confused, then intrigued. You understand German?" he asked, taking a few steps closer. Clara nodded shyly, a small strand of blonde hair falling over her eye. "Grandpa Walter taught me. He was born there," she answered, looking down at her worn shoes. "He says it's important to remember where we come from." A murmur went through the room. Weissmann, now visibly interested, addressed the girl in German, his voice deep but gentle. "Wie heißt du, kleines Mädchen?" Clara looked up, meeting the imposing man's gaze. "Clara," she replied. Fragt meinen Namen," she explained to Charles, translating that the man had asked for her name. Elena approached her daughter, placing protective hands on her shoulders. "I'm sorry, Mr. Spencer. She didn't mean to interrupt. We'll go back to our corner." Charles raised a hand, silencing her. His calculating eyes shifted between the girl and the German investor. Weissmann seemed genuinely interested, the first sign of emotion he had shown since his arrival. "Wie alt bist du, Clara?" Weissmann continued. "He wants to know my age," Clara translated, looking at Charles. "6 years old, sir," she answered in German, holding up 6 fingers. A small smile appeared on the investor's face. He spoke again, a longer sentence this time. Clara listened attentively, then turned to Charles. "He said he's impressed. That my grandfather taught me very well and that my German is very good for such a little girl." Charles made a decision in that moment, a risky one, but possibly the only way out of the impending disaster. "Elena," he said to the cleaning lady, who remained tense beside her daughter, "could your daughter help us tonight? Our interpreter didn't show up, and we have a very important matter to discuss with Mr. Weissmann." Eleanor's eyes widened in surprise. "But, sir, she's just a child. She doesn't understand business." "A child who speaks fluent German," Charles completed. "It will only be for tonight, and Spencer will compensate you generously for the service." Elena hesitated, looking at Clara, who was watching the conversation with curiosity. "What do you think, Clara?" she asked gently. "Can you help Mr. Spencer talk to the German gentleman?" Clara thought for a moment, biting her lower lip, then nodded, determined. "Grandpa would be proud," she answered simply. "He always says we should help when we can." Charles smiled for the first time that night, a genuine smile, not the one rehearsed for negotiations. "Excellent. Henry, please, find a place for Clara at the table and bring her something to eat." Minutes later, the scene at Le Chateau was surreal. At one of the most elegant tables in the restaurant, among businessmen in expensive suits, sat a 6-year-old girl, her feet dangling without reaching the floor, translating a multi-million-dollar negotiation. At first, Clara seemed shy, her voice almost a whisper as she translated Weissmann's words. But as the conversation progressed, she gained confidence. Her childish innocence made the translation peculiarly direct, without the diplomatic flourishes typical of professional interpreters. "He says the numbers don't make sense," Clara translated at one point, after Weissmann analyzed some documents. "That the forecast for next year is, how do you say it, too optimistic?" Charles quickly adjusted his strategy. The unexpected frankness of Clara's translation forced him to be more direct and honest than he had originally planned. To his surprise, this seemed to please Weissmann, who valued clarity above all else. "Tell him we recognize the optimism of the projections," Charles replied, looking directly at Clara. "Sir, but we believe in the potential of the new product," Clara translated, focused, sometimes pausing to think of the right word. Weissman listened intently, his gaze shifting between the girl and Charles. Elena watched the scene from a distance, alternating between motherly pride and nervousness. Mr. Moretti had assured her she could stay there, temporarily excusing her from her duties while Clara helped with the meeting. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place, watching her daughter, who usually played with second-hand dolls, now sitting among the powerful. As dinner went on, something unexpected happened. Clara's presence had completely transformed the atmosphere. The initial tension gave way to an almost cordial environment. Weissman, who rarely smiled during negotiations, seemed charmed by the little interpreter, occasionally asking questions about her life and family. "He's asking if I go to schools," Clara translated at one point. "I said yes, but that sometimes it's hard because we have to buy medicine for Grandpa." Charles noticed a flicker of surprise in Weissman's eyes after that answer. The German investor spoke again, this time at greater length. "He says," Clara translated, concentrating, "that he admires families that help each other, that it shows character, and he likes to do business with people of character." The comment wasn't directed at Clara's situation, but at Charles himself and his company. Something in the girl's sincerity had created an unexpected bridge, humanizing a negotiation that would normally be cold and calculated. When it came time to discuss the more complex terms of the agreement, Charles feared that Clara's linguistic ability would reach its limits. To his surprise, the girl continued to translate with impressive accuracy, sometimes asking for more technical terms to be repeated, but never losing the thread of the conversation. "He wants to know about the guarantees," she translated at one point, frowning. "If you will protect his investment if things don't work out as you expect." Charles explained in detail the guarantees offered, watching Clara translate his words with a seriousness that seemed out of place on her childish face. It was as if she intuited the importance of the moment, even without fully understanding what was at stake. By the time dessert arrived, the mood had changed. Charles realized that, against all odds, the negotiation was progressing. The points of friction had been addressed with a refreshing clarity, and Weissman seemed more receptive than in any previous meeting. Clara ate her chocolate ice cream with obvious delight, occasionally licking the spoon while listening attentively to Weissman speak. Her childish professionalism, alternating between the seriousness of translation and the genuine joy of a child savoring a special dessert, created a contrast that seemed to enchant the German investor. "He says," Clara translated as a small smudge of chocolate formed at the corner of her mouth, "that he needs to think about the final details, but that he is inclined to accept the deal." A collective sigh of relief went around the table. Charles maintained his composure, but inside he felt a wave of gratitude and relief he hadn't experienced in years. "Ask him if there is anything else we can do to finalize the deal," Charles instructed. Clara translated the question. Weissman smiled, looking directly at the girl as he replied. "He says you've already done enough," Clara translated. "That sometimes the best negotiation is one where everyone leaves happy." When Weissman finally stood up to leave, he extended his hand first to Clara, speaking a few words in German that made the girl smile. "What did he say?" Charles asked. "He thanked me," Clara replied with a shy smile. "He said I have a bright future, and that my grandpa must be a very special man." Weissman then turned to Charles, speaking in English for the first time that night, with a heavy accent. "The contract, Mr. Spencer, my lawyers will be in touch tomorrow to finalize, and you might want to consider offering a scholarship to your young interpreter. Talents like that are rare." With a brief nod, the German investor left, leaving behind a room in a state of shock and contained euphoria. As soon as the door closed behind Weissman, the Spencer executives erupted in quiet celebrations, shaking hands and patting each other on the back. Charles stood still, watching Clara, who now looked tired, her eyes heavy after hours of intense concentration. Something moved within him, an emotion he couldn't immediately name. For years, he had built his life around absolute control, predictability, power. And now, his most important negotiation, which would define the future of his company, had been saved by a 6-year-old child, the daughter of a cleaning lady. His wounded pride battled with an overwhelming gratitude. Clara's innocent voice, translating complex financial terms without fully understanding their meaning, had achieved what weeks of carefully crafted strategies could not, winning the trust of Kurt Weissman. "Mr. Spencer," Henry's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Are the documents for tomorrow?" "Later," Charles cut him off, without taking his eyes off Clara, who was now in her mother's arms, almost asleep. "Right now, we need to properly thank our Savior." Charles approached Elena and Clara, noticing for the first time the weariness in the woman's eyes, the marks of a life of hard work on her hands. "Oh, I don't know how to thank you," he said sincerely. "Your daughter saved more than a negotiation tonight. She saved 60 jobs and the future of my company." Elena smiled, holding Clara tighter. "She's special," she replied simply, "and very stubborn like her grandfather." Charles nodded, taking a card from his pocket. "I'd like to discuss how I can properly repay you. Please, call me tomorrow." As he watched mother and daughter leave the restaurant, Charles felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. A genuine human connection, beyond numbers, contracts, and power. Clara had touched something inside him that he thought was dormant, or perhaps lost forever. That night, returning to his lonely penthouse overlooking the city, Charles couldn't get Clara's face out of his mind, the way she translated with such seriousness, alternating with moments of pure, childish innocence, the simplicity with which she had mentioned her sick grandfather, without self-pity or drama. For the first time in years, he fell asleep thinking not of strategies or acquisitions, but of a little blonde girl with clear eyes, whose purity had illuminated a path he didn't know he needed to follow. And, also for the first time in a long time, he felt something different from ambition and coldness. He felt hope. 3 days had passed since the dinner with Kurt Weissman. The contract was signed, the lawyers were satisfied, and the future of Spencer Investments was secure for the next few years. Charles had celebrated discreetly with his team, received congratulations from the board, and even a rare compliment from his mentor, Old Man Thompson, who rarely showed enthusiasm for anything. Still, something bothered him. The image of Clara translating with childish seriousness wouldn't leave his mind. He had sent a generous bonus to Elena through the restaurant manager, more money than she probably earned in 3 months. But it didn't feel like enough. It wasn't just about money, it was something deeper, a debt that went beyond the financial. On Friday afternoon, after ending a meeting early, Charles found himself driving towards Le Chateau. He hadn't planned the visit, hadn't made an appointment with anyone. He simply felt he needed to go there. The restaurant looked different in the daylight, without the nighttime glow of the chandeliers and the buzz of elegant customers. Staff were setting tables for dinner, polishing silverware and adjusting floral arrangements. "Mr. Spencer," Manager Moretti appeared, surprised, quickly adjusting his tie. "We weren't expecting you today. May I prepare a table?" "I'm not here for dinner, Moretti," Charles replied, looking around. "I'm looking for Eleanor and her daughter." "Are they here?" The manager looked confused for a moment, then nodded. "Elena is finishing cleaning the private room. Clara usually arrives after school, around 4. She should be with her mother now." Charles thanked him and walked through the restaurant to the room where, days earlier, he had closed the deal with Weissman. The door was ajar. Inside, Eleanor was cleaning the tall windows with precise, efficient movements. Clara was sitting at a table in the corner, drawing intently in a worn-out notebook. Charles watched the scene for a moment before knocking lightly on the door. Eleanor turned quickly, surprised to see him. "Mr. Spencer." She quickly came down from the stepladder she was on. "I didn't know you were coming today." "I didn't tell anyone," he replied with a slight smile. "It was a last-minute decision." Clara looked up from her drawing, and upon recognizing him, broke into a spontaneous smile that lit up her face. Charles was taken aback by the girl's genuine joy at seeing him, something he wasn't used to. People usually smiled at him out of interest or obligation, not pure happiness to see him again. "Hello, Mr. Charlie," Clara greeted, using the nickname that no one but his closest friends dared to use. "Clara," Elena gently reprimanded, "it's Mr. Spencer to you." "It's all right," Charles interrupted, approaching the table where the girl was drawing. "So you can call me Charlie." He looked at Clara's drawing, a colorful depiction of what looked like the restaurant one with small figures around a table. He recognized the attempt to portray the night of the dinner with Weissman. "You draw very well," he commented. Clara smiled, proud. "Grandpa Walter taught me. He used to draw a lot before he got sick." Elena approached, nervously adjusting her uniform. "Mr. Spencer, I wanted to thank you for the money you sent. It was very generous, but you didn't have to." "It was well deserved," Charles interrupted her. "Honest, without Clara's help, I would have lost the most important contract of my career." He paused, looking again at the girl, who had gone back to coloring her drawing. "Actually, I came here to talk to you both, especially with Clara." Eleanor looked confused but nodded, gesturing to two chairs near the table where her daughter was drawing. Charles sat down, adjusting his expensive suit, feeling strangely out of place in this everyday setting, far from the boardrooms and luxurious offices where he spent most of his days. "Clara," he called softly, waiting for the girl to look up from her drawing. "You helped me a lot that night. More than you can imagine." The girl looked at him with those attentive blue eyes, as if she could see beyond his facade as a successful businessman. "The contract we closed with Mr. Weissman saved my company from serious trouble. It saved a lot of people's jobs." Clara nodded, as if she understood the gravity of the situation, although Charles suspected she didn't fully grasp the scope of his words. "I wanted to repay you somehow," he continued. "So, I want to make you an offer. You can ask for anything." "Anything you want." Eleanor looked alarmed, opening her mouth to protest, but Charles gently raised a hand, asking her to wait. "I'm serious. Anything within my power. A new game, books, maybe a trip, or something for school. Do you have a dream, Clara?" The girl grew serious for a moment, her clear eyes fixed on Charles's. There was no enthusiastic reaction as he had expected, no impulsive request for toys or treats. Instead, Clara seemed to be considering the offer with a maturity surprising for someone her age. After a few seconds that felt much longer, she replied simply, "I'd like you to help my grandpa Walter, he's sick." The answer caught Charles completely off guard. He had expected typical childhood requests, an expensive toy, perhaps, or a trip to an amusement park. Not this. Not a request so selfless, so devoid of self-interest. "Clara," Eleanor began, embarrassed, "we can't ask that of Mr. Spencer. He's already been very generous." But Charles was barely listening. He stared at the girl, her expression serious, her eyes bright with hope. The request wasn't for herself, not to satisfy her own childish desires. It was for someone she loved. "What does your grandfather have?" he finally asked, his voice softer than usual. "The doctors said it's a heart problem," Clara replied. "He gets tired very quickly now. He can't take me to the park anymore or teach me how to draw properly. Mommy works a lot to buy his medicine." Elena looked uncomfortable, torn between embarrassment and hope. "Mr. Spencer, please, don't feel obligated. The medications are expensive. Yes, but we're managing. Clara doesn't really understand these things." "Yes, I do," the girl protested. "Yeah, Grandpa needs a good doctor. Good doctors are expensive, and you cry at night when you think I'm not listening." The silence that followed was heavy. Elena looked down, unable to deny her daughter's words. Charles felt something break inside him, a barrier he didn't even know existed. For years, he had shielded himself from the needs of others, seeing people only as resources or obstacles in his plans. Clients, employees, competitors, all categorized according to their usefulness. But Clara was different. Her disarming honesty, her direct and sincere gaze, her genuine concern for her sick grandfather, all of it hit Charles in a place he thought had long been dormant. "I'd like to meet your grandfather," he said finally, surprising himself as much as Elena, "and see what I can do to help him." Clara's face lit up instantly, as if someone had turned on a light inside her. "Really? You're really going to help Grandpa?" Charles nodded, feeling a strange mix of emotions. There was a satisfaction there different from anything he had ever experienced, different from closing million-dollar deals or outmaneuvering competitors. It was something simpler and at the same time more profound. "Yes, Clara. I'll do what I can to help your grandfather." Eleanor looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion, as if she couldn't quite believe that a man like Charles Spencer was really willing to help her family without some hidden agenda. "Why would you do this for us?" she finally asked, her voice almost a whisper. Charles looked at Clara, who was now smiling, enthusiastically returning to her drawing, probably already adding this new development to her visual story. "Because sometimes," he replied slowly, searching for the right words, "we need to be reminded of what truly matters." Elena nodded, still uncertain but with a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Charles took a business card from his pocket, turned it over, and wrote his personal number on the back. "Call me tomorrow. We'll arrange a visit to your father." As he stood up to leave, he felt Clara's small hand take his for a moment. "Thank you, Mr. Charlie?" That innocent touch, the simple gratitude in her voice, stirred something unexpected in Charles, a lump in his throat, an emotion he couldn't name. He just nodded, unable to reply. Leaving the restaurant into the afternoon light, Charles Spencer, the man who had built a financial empire through cold, calculated decisions, felt strangely disarmed by a simple 6-year-old child, a child who, when offered anything in the world, thought not of herself but of someone she loved. Sunday dawned overcast, with a fine drizzle falling over the city. Charles drove his silver Audi following the GPS instructions, gradually moving away from the wide avenues and imposing buildings of the financial district towards a simpler area on the outskirts. As he drove on, the buildings became more modest, the designer stores giving way to small neighborhood shops. He parked in front of a small apartment complex, 3-story blocks painted a pale yellow, faded by time. He looked at the address on his phone, confirming he was in the right place, and felt a momentary hesitation, an unusual feeling for someone accustomed to making quick decisions involving millions. Why was he here? He could have simply sent a generous check, hired the best doctors, handled everything from a distance. However, the memory of Clara's hopeful eyes kept him firm in his decision. He had given his word, and something about that child made him want to keep it personally. He got out of the car, feeling the curious gazes of the residents. His cashmere coat and Italian shoes made him stand out immediately in that simple setting. He went up to the second floor, finding apartment 203 at the end of the hallway. The paint on the door was peeling, but there was a small handmade wreath hanging there, made of colorful paper flowers. Before he could knock, the door opened, revealing the girl's radiant face. "Mr. Charlie, you really came," she exclaimed, as if until that moment she had doubted he would keep his promise. "I said I would," he replied, surprised at his own punctuality. He was usually only this punctual for important business meetings. Clara took him by the hand, pulling him inside with a familiarity that surprised him. The apartment was small but impressively clean and organized. Simple furniture, some visibly worn from use, filled the space functionally. A 2-seater sofa with a few discreet patches, a small dining table with 4 chairs, and a modest bookshelf with a few books. The walls, though the paint was worn in places, were decorated with colorful drawings, certainly Clara's work. "Our mommy is finishing lunch," Clara explained, still holding his hand. "She made roasted chicken and potatoes. It's Grandpa's favorite." Charles noticed the pleasant smell coming from the small kitchen, where Eleanor moved efficiently between the stove and the sink. She turned upon hearing her daughter's voice, wiping her hands on her apron. Her blonde hair was tied in a simple bun, and she wore jeans and a blue blouse, so different from the grey restaurant uniform that Charles almost didn't recognize her. "Mr. Spencer, welcome to our home," she greeted with a nervous smile. "I hope you don't mind the simplicity." "Please, call me Charles," he replied, trying to ease the woman's obvious tension. "Sass, and thank you for the invitation. You didn't need to prepare anything special." "Clara insisted," Elena explained. "She said it would be polite to offer food to an important visitor." The girl smiled, proud of her etiquette. "And where is your father?" Charles asked, looking around. "Grandpa is in his room," Clara answered, pulling him by the hand again. "He always rests a little in the morning. The doctor said it's important. Come on, I'll introduce you." She led him down a short hallway to a room at the end. The door was ajar, and Clara knocked lightly before entering. "Grandpa, I brought Mr. Charlie to meet you." The room was simple and cozy. A single bed took up most of the space, covered with a neatly arranged blue quilt. Beside it, a small table with organized medicines, a glass of water, and a small antique radio playing classical music at a low volume. On the opposite wall, a bookshelf with worn books, some in German. A worn armchair stood near the only window, which let in the soft light of that overcast morning. Sitting in the armchair was a man of about 75. Thin, with thinning white hair, he wore a blue wool sweater over a plaid shirt. His hands, resting on an open book, showed prominent veins and age spots. But they still looked strong, hands that had worked hard throughout his life. What impressed Charles most, however, were his eyes. Blue like Clara's, they conveyed a serenity and kindness that contrasted with his evident physical fragility. When the old man smiled, his whole face lit up, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening like marks from a lifetime of smiles. "So this is the famous Mr. Charlie," Walter said, his voice low but firm, a slight German accent coloring his words. "And my granddaughter hasn't talked about anything else for days." Clara ran to her grandfather, climbing onto his lap with the ease of someone finding their safest place in the world. Walter hugged her affectionately, kissing the top of her blonde head, and the contrast between his wrinkled hands and the girl's golden hair created an image that touched Charles in an unexpected way. "So it's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Walter," Charles said, stepping forward to shake his hand. "Your granddaughter is an extraordinary child." Walter shook his hand with surprising firmness. "Please, have a seat," he invited, gesturing to a nearby chair. "And I agree. Clara is our light. Everything I know, I try to pass on to her. Languages, drawing, music. She absorbs knowledge like a sponge." Charles sat down, feeling strangely nervous, a sensation he rarely experienced, even in the most tense negotiations. There was something about Walter's calm presence that made him feel simultaneously at ease and uncomfortable. "She saved a very important negotiation for my company," Charles explained. Her fluency in German was providential. Walter smiled and stroking Clara's hair, who was now distractedly playing with a button on his sweater. "I started teaching her when she was just 3, he said with pride. "Children absorb languages like sponges, and I wanted her to know her roots." "You were born in Germany?" Charles asked, genuinely interested. "Yes, in a small town near Frankfurt. I came here when I was in my early 20s, looking for a better life." The conversation flowed with surprising ease. Walter, despite his frail physical condition, had a sharp mind and a captivating way of telling stories. He spoke of his youth in Germany, his arrival in the new country, the various jobs he'd had, in factories, restaurants, and finally as a gardener at the homes of wealthy families. Clara remained on his lap the entire time, occasionally contributing to the conversation or correcting a detail in her grandfather's narrative, showing she had heard those stories many times. "Grandpa tells the best stories," she said to Charles. "He's seen things we only read about in books." Charles watched the interaction between the two, noticing the strong bond that united them. It was more than just family love. There was a complicity, a mutual understanding that transcended the age difference. Elena appeared at the door, announcing that lunch was ready. Walter tried to get up, but the effort made him cough and momentarily lose his breath. "Grandpa, remember what the doctor said?" Clara gently scolded him, getting off his lap. "So I'll help you." With a naturalness that indicated a daily ritual, the girl reached for a small oxygen tank near the armchair, adjusting the mask on her grandfather's face with the skill of someone who had done it hundreds of times. Walter took a few deep breaths while Clara waited patiently, her small hand resting on her grandfather's arm. Charles watched the scene in silence, an unexpected emotion tightening his chest. The interaction between the frail old man and the 6-year-old girl overflowed with a love and dignity he had rarely witnessed. There was no drama, no laments, just a mutual care as natural as breathing. After a few moments, Walter removed the mask, thanking his granddaughter with a smile. "Tired better now," he said, reaching for his cane. "Let's have lunch before your mother thinks we don't like her cooking." With the help of the cane and Charles's discreet support, Walter managed to stand and walk slowly to the living room, where Eleanor had set the table for lunch. Charles noticed how Clara stayed close to her grandfather, attentive but not smothering, offering support only when needed. The meal was simple but delicious. Charles couldn't remember the last time he'd had a home-cooked lunch like that, accustomed as he was to fine dining restaurants and gourmet food delivered to his penthouse. There was something comforting in the simplicity of that roasted chicken and potatoes served on ordinary plates, accompanied by unpretentious conversation. Clara kept the atmosphere lively, telling stories from school and asking Charles questions about his company. Walter ate slowly, clearly enjoying not just the food but the company. His eyes often lingered on Clara, watching her with a pure love that Charles almost envied. After dessert, a simple apple pie that Clara announced she had helped make, the girl excused herself to show her drawings to Charles. Eleanor began to clear the plates, while Walter remained at the table, watching him with a look that seemed to hold something beyond mere curiosity. "Hey, Clara, why don't you help your mom in the kitchen for a moment?" Walter suggested. "I'd like to have a word with Mr. Spencer alone." The girl nodded, taking a few plates with her to the kitchen. When they were alone, Walter leaned slightly towards Charles. "Do you know why I agreed to let you come here today?" he asked, his voice now lower. Charles shook his head, intrigued. "Because Clara trusts you and I trust her judgment," Walter continued. "But also because, ever since she mentioned your full name, something seemed familiar." His blue eyes, so similar to Clara's, studied Charles's face with growing intensity. "Spencer, Charles Spencer," he murmured, as if savoring the name. "As when you were younger, you were called Charlie, weren't you?" Charles nodded, surprised. "At the big house on Oak Street, the mansion with the white rose garden." A shiver ran down Charles's spine. Oak Street was where his childhood home was, his parents' mansion, sold many years ago after their deaths. Walter smiled, a glimmer of recognition in his tired eyes. "So you're little Charlie from the mansion," he said, his voice weak but full of certainty. "The boy who used to hide among the azalea bushes when his parents argued." Charles felt the blood drain from his face. Long-buried memories began to surface, fragments of an almost forgotten past. The azalea bushes, his secret hiding place. Intimate details of his lonely childhood that no one else knew. How do you know that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Because I was the gardener at that house, Charlie, for almost 15 years. Walter extended a trembling hand, briefly touching Charles's arm. "I took care of the roses your mother loved so much. And sometimes I took care of you too, when no one else noticed you needed attention." Charles felt as if the floor had disappeared from under his feet. Walter, Clara's sick grandfather, the man he had come to help as a gesture of gratitude, was the Mr. Walter from the garden, the gentle figure who populated some of his few happy childhood memories. The man who, on lonely days, taught him the names of plants, who let him help water the flowers, entrusting him with small tasks that made him feel important, who occasionally told stories about a distant country called Germany, about castles and enchanted forests. "I didn't expect you to remember me," Walter continued, noticing the shock on Charles's face. "So you were so little, and it's been so long." But when Clara talked about the important man she had helped, something stirred in my memory. Charles couldn't speak. An avalanche of emotions and memories washed over him. The smell of wet earth, the sound of pruning shears working on the bushes, the calm voice explaining the difference between tulips and daffodils, the taste of the German cookies that occasionally appeared in a small package, like a secret gift. "You used to give me cookies," he finally managed to say, his voice unrecognizable even to himself. "Lebkuchen, in the winter." Walter smiled, his eyes shining with restrained emotion. "You remember," he said softly. "I always knew you had a good memory and a kind heart, hidden under all that premature seriousness. You were an unusual child, Charlie. So observant, so sensitive. I sometimes worried about you, alone in that huge house." Charles felt something warm and wet on his face and realized with a shock that they were tears, something he hadn't experienced in years. Memories continued to surface, like bubbles rising to the surface of a deep lake. Walter's infinite patience with his incessant questions about every plant, every insect, every natural phenomenon. "I remember," he said, his voice regaining strength. "I remember you, Mr. Walter." Walter's revelation triggered an avalanche of memories in Charles. Sitting in that simple room, he closed his eyes for a moment, letting himself be transported to the past. Suddenly, he saw himself again as an 8-year-old boy, running through the gardens of the mansion on Oak Street, the perfectly manicured lawn under his feet, the scent of roses in the air, the metallic sound of pruning shears working on the bushes. And Walter, always Walter, with his straw hat and calloused hands, tending to the plants with the dedication of someone cultivating treasures. "Be patient, Charlie," Walter would say in that distant memory as he showed the boy how to plant sunflower seeds. "Nature has its own time. We can't rush a flower to bloom, just as we can't force people to grow up before their time." Charles remembered Sunday mornings when his parents slept in late after elegant parties, and he would sneak out to the garden, knowing he would find Walter working, even on his day off. "Why do you come to work when you don't have to?" he once asked him. Walter smiled, looking at the bed of tulips blooming in vibrant colors. "This isn't work for me, Charlie. It's love. When you do something for love, you don't count the hours or expect a reward. The beauty you help create is reward enough." The memories kept coming, more and more vivid. Walter teaching him to identify birds by their song. Walter showing him how nature worked in cycles, how each season had its own beauty, how even winter, seemingly barren, prepared the way for the explosion of life in spring. "Everything in life has its purpose, Charlie. Even what seems useless or ugly at first sight," he would say, showing the boy how dead leaves turned into compost for new plants. "Sometimes it's in our losses that we find our greatest gains. It takes wisdom to see that." A wave of shame washed over Charles. How could he have forgotten? How could he have buried so deeply these precious memories, these teachings that, he now realized, had shaped fundamental parts of who he was? When Walter disappeared from the mansion, now Charles remembered clearly, he had asked his parents for days, weeks, where the gardener was. "He's gone," they answered coldly. Forget him. He was just an employee. And Charles, still a child, eventually did as he was told. He forgot, or pretended to forget. "Charlie!" Walter's voice, now old and frail, brought him back to the present. "Are you all right?" Charles blinked, realizing that silent tears were streaming down his face. How long had it been since he cried? He couldn't remember. "I'm fine," he answered, discreetly wiping his eyes. "Just remembering." Walter nodded, understanding perfectly. Memories are like dormant seeds. Sometimes they lie under the earth for years, seemingly dead, until the right conditions awakened them again. Eleanor entered the room, announcing that coffee was ready. Clara followed closely behind, carrying a drawing pad and colored pencils. For the rest of the visit, Charles remained quieter, absorbing the affectionate simplicity of that home, so different from his luxurious and empty penthouse. He watched Clara draw intently, her tongue stuck between her teeth in creative effort, so much like her grandfather in her gestures and mannerisms. In Clara's room, Charles saw walls covered with drawings, flowers, people, animals. One in particular caught his eye, a tall man with graying hair working in a garden, while a little blonde girl watched him. "That's Grandpa, when he was a gardener," Clara explained. "He tells me stories about the gardens he used to take care of, and I imagine what it would be like to be there with him." Charles felt his throat tighten. That scene, in its childish simplicity, was exactly what he himself had experienced so many times. Looking out the window, Charles saw children playing in the apartment complex's courtyard. He remembered Walter encouraging him to play with the employees' children, despite his shyness. The fear of being rejected is like a fence we build around ourselves. It protects us, yes, but it also prevents us from exploring the garden beyond. That fence eventually became a wall over the years, thick, high, seemingly impenetrable. Charles had built his adult life inside that wall, convincing himself that the security and control it provided compensated for the loneliness. When it was finally time to leave, Charles felt transformed. Something fundamental had changed within him, as if a long-locked door had suddenly been opened, allowing light and fresh air into forgotten chambers of his being. He said goodbye to Walter with a careful hug, promising to return soon. Eleanor thanked him once again for his visit and the help he had offered. At the door, Clara stopped him, holding out a piece of paper. "For you, Mr. Charlie," she said with childish seriousness. It was a simple but expressive drawing, 3 figures holding hands, a man in a suit, clearly him, an elderly gentleman, Walter, and a little blonde girl, Clara. Above them, a large yellow sun was smiling. "So you don't forget us," Clara explained. Charles held the paper carefully, as if it were a fragile and priceless treasure. In that moment, he promised himself that this time would be different. This time he would not forget. Charles wasted no time. The morning after his visit to Walter's home, he called Dr. Lawrence, his personal physician for over a decade. "I need a referral," he said, skipping the usual pleasantries. "The best cardiologist in the city. Cost is not an issue." 3 days later, Walter was being examined by Dr. Steinberg, a renowned specialist who usually had a months-long waiting list. The diagnosis confirmed what they already knew, a chronic heart condition, aggravated by age. But the new proposed treatment offered more promising prospects than the basic care Walter had been receiving. "I don't know how to thank you," Elena said when Charles explained the arrangements he had made. His health insurance would never cover these specialists. "There's nothing to thank me for," Charles replied with a simplicity that surprised himself. "It's the least I can do." But Charles knew it wasn't the least. It was just the beginning. Starting that week, he reorganized his schedule, something unthinkable until recently. Henry, his assistant, looked at him with growing bewilderment each time Charles cancelled meetings that were previously top priority or delegated decisions he would normally insist on making himself. "Is everything all right, sir?" Henry asked one afternoon, after Charles turned down a business trip to Tokyo they had been planning for months. "Better than ever," Charles replied, surprised by the sincerity of his own statement. In the weeks that followed, Charles began to establish a routine that included regular visits to the Kowalski family's apartment. At first, his visits always had some pretext: updates on the medical treatment, documents to sign, appointments to schedule. But soon, the pretexts became unnecessary. It was clear to everyone, including himself, that he simply enjoyed being there. It was a rainy Thursday when Charles arrived at the apartment with a carefully wrapped package under his arm. Clara opened the door, her blue eyes lighting up when she saw him. "Mr. Charlie," she exclaimed, hugging him impulsively. "You came on my math homework day. Can you help me? Mommy doesn't understand fractions very well." Charles felt an involuntary smile form on his face. Weeks ago, he would have considered helping a 6-year-old with homework an absurd waste of his valuable time. Now, he felt genuinely enthusiastic about the possibility. "Of course I'll help," he replied, entering the familiar apartment that no longer felt strange to him. But first, I brought something for your grandfather." Walter was in his usual armchair, but Charles immediately noticed the small improvements in his appearance. The new treatment was working. There was more color in his cheeks. His breathing seemed less labored. "Charlie," the old man greeted with a warm smile. "Fire punctual as always." Charles handed the package to Walter, feeling a strange nervousness. "I found this and thought of you." Walter opened the wrapping carefully, revealing an old book on gardening, a long out-of-print collector's edition. "My goodness," Walter murmured, running his trembling fingers over the embossed cover. "And I remember looking at this book in shop windows so many years ago. I could never afford it." "Open it," Charles suggested. Walter complied, and his eyes widened when he found a yellowed photograph pressed between the pages. In it, a much younger Walter and a little Charles were smiling next to a newly planted rose bush. "For you kept this?" Walter asked, his voice trembling with emotion. "I found it in an old box in storage," Charles explained. "I didn't know I still had it until I started looking." The truth was, Charles had spent hours rummaging through boxes of memories he had deliberately ignored for years, determined to find that specific photograph he remembered being taken the day they planted the Rosa alba maxima. Clara leaned over the arm of her grandfather's chair, studying the photograph with interest. "That's you, Grandpa. And is that little boy Mr. Charlie? He was little like me." "We were all little once, Clara," Walter replied, a nostalgic smile on his face. "Even important people like Mr. Charlie." "You were important too," Charles said, surprising himself with the emotion in his voice. "More than I realized at the time." Elena, who was watching the scene from the kitchen, quickly wiped away a tear before announcing, "Dinner is almost ready. Clara, wash your hands and help set the table, please." "But Mr. Charlie is going to help me with my fractions," the girl protested. "After dinner," Charles promised. "The fractions aren't going anywhere." Meals at the Kowalskis had become one of his favorite times. The food was simple, very different from the fine dining restaurants he frequented, but there was something comforting about those homemade dishes, prepared with evident care. "It's my grandmother's recipe," Eleanor explained when Charles complimented the stew she had served that night. "Traditional Polish food. My father grew up eating this." Walter nodded, savoring each bite with obvious pleasure. "My wife learned to cook from my mother, and now Elena keeps the tradition." "And I'm learning too," Clara intervened proudly. "I already know how to make pierogi by myself, almost by myself," she corrected herself, after a look from her mother. Charles watched the interaction between the three, feeling a pang of something he took a moment to identify as envy. Not petty envy, but a longing for what he had never had: family traditions, knowledge passed down from generation to generation, the sense of continuity and belonging that it provided. "Mr. Charlie, do you know how to cook?" Clara asked, interrupting his thoughts. "I'm afraid not," Charles admitted, "for I've always had people to do that for me." "I can teach you," Clara offered, excited by the idea. "We'll start with something easy, like cookies. Grandpa says teaching is the best way to learn more." "Your grandfather is a wise man," Charles replied, smiling at Walter, "and I accept the offer. It's never too late to learn, right?" "Never," Walter agreed. That's one of the few certainties I have after all these years." After dinner, and after helping Clara with her fractions, which proved to be surprisingly rewarding, Charles helped Elena wash the dishes while Walter and Clara played a card game at the living room table. "You don't have to do this," Elena said, referring to both the dishes and his frequent visits. "I know I don't have to," Charles replied. "I want to." Elena studied him for a moment, as if trying to solve a puzzle. "You've changed," she observed finally, "since the first time you came here." Charles considered that as he carefully dried a plate. "I think I'm remembering who I was," he said at last. "Or maybe who I could have been." In the following weeks, Charles continued his routine of visits, becoming more and more integrated into the family's life. He was there when Clara got top marks on her science project, and herbarium that Walter had helped plan and that Charles had printed on special paper. He was there when Walter had a bad day and needed to stay on complete rest, patiently listening to the old man's stories of his youth, stories he now realized were a priceless treasure. On a sunny Sunday afternoon, Charles took Clara and Walter to a nearby park, while Elena took the opportunity to rest, a rare luxury for her. He pushed Walter's wheelchair, used only for longer outings, along the well-kept paths, while Clara ran ahead, pointing out birds and flowers with contagious enthusiasm. "Is that a sparrow, Grandpa?" she asked, pointing to a small bird on a nearby branch. "Almost, dear, it's a goldfinch, sir." Notice the yellow patches on its wings. Charles smiled, remembering how Walter had taught him to identify birds in a similar way, decades ago. The sense of continuity, of a circle closing, was almost palpable. "What is it?" Walter asked, noticing his smile. "I was thinking about how some things don't change," Charles replied. "You're still an excellent teacher." Walter looked at Clara, who was now trying to coax a squirrel to come closer by offering crumbs from a snack they had brought. "Teaching Clara has been one of the greatest joys of my old age," he said. "Children give us back something we lose over time, the capacity to marvel at the world." Charles nodded, watching Clara. Her expression of pure delight when the squirrel finally took a crumb from her outstretched hand was something that no business meeting, no million-dollar contract, no successful acquisition had ever given him. "I think I'm learning that now," he said softly. When they returned to the apartment, they found Eleanor rested and smiling, something Charles had rarely seen. She had prepared a simple snack, and the four of them sat down for tea and sandwiches, while Clara excitedly recounted every detail of her park adventure. Charles watched the scene with a growing sense of peace. There, in that modest living room, with that unlikely family that fate had placed in his path, he felt more at home than in his luxurious penthouse. That evening, driving back to his apartment, Charles recognized that something fundamental had changed within him. The walls he had built over the years, walls of unbridled ambition, of mistrust, of emotional distance, were beginning to crumble. Clara's drawing, now framed and hanging in his living room, seemed to capture not just a childish wish, but a real possibility. Different people, from different worlds, united by something stronger than circumstances or social conventions. Charles Spencer, the man who had built his adult life around control, power, and material success, was relearning something that the boy Charlie had known instinctively before the world taught him to forget: the art of simply feeling, joy, tenderness, connection, belonging. And surprisingly, there was nothing scary about it. On the contrary, it was like returning to a long-forgotten home that had always been there, patiently waiting for his return. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon. Eleanor had taken Clara to a schoolmate's birthday party, and Charles had taken the opportunity to visit Walter without the usual distractions. Not that he didn't appreciate Clara's energy or Elena's discreet presence, but there were questions that had hung between him and Walter since their first meeting, issues from the past that needed to be clarified, gaps that needed to be filled. The two men were sitting on the apartment's small balcony. The day was mild, with a light breeze rustling the leaves of the trees in the courtyard. Walter looked better than he had in previous weeks. The new treatment was clearly taking effect. His breathing was more regular, there was more color in his face, and he could talk for longer periods without getting tired. Charles had brought a bottle of red wine, nothing too fancy but good quality. Walter accepted a small glass, despite initial protests about his medical restrictions. "Once a week won't kill me," the old man argued with a smile. "Besides, There are certain conversations that call for a little wine. Charles nodded, instinctively understanding what Walter meant. There was a subtle tension in the air, a sense that they were on the verge of something important, of a long-delayed revelation. They talked for a while about everyday matters, Clara's progress in school, Elena's job at the restaurant, the small improvements Charles had discreetly arranged for the apartment, like the new heating system and the more comfortable sofa that had, coincidentally, been delivered the week before. "You've always been like this, haven't you?" Walter commented with a slight smile. "Generous, but trying not to draw attention to it." Charles frowned, surprised. "I don't know if I'd describe myself that way. I remember when you gave your lunch to the assistant gardener's son, that scrawny boy. You told him you weren't hungry, but I saw you looking on with envy as he ate the sandwich your mother had specially prepared for you." The memory, so specific and long forgotten, took Charles by surprise. "You noticed those things?" "I noticed everything about you, Charlie," Walter replied simply. "Oh, you were an extraordinary child, hidden under layers of shyness and that premature seriousness your parents valued so much." It was Walter who finally changed the course of the conversation after a long moment of contemplative silence. "Have you ever wondered, Charlie, why I disappeared so suddenly from the mansion?" Charles took a sip of wine, buying time. So of course he had wondered. The question had been tormenting him since their reunion, but something had stopped him from asking directly. Perhaps fear of the answer, perhaps respect for Walter's timing. "Many times," he finally admitted. "My parents just said you had left without notice. Later, I heard something about improper conduct, but I never knew the details." Walter nodded slowly, looking past the balcony railing as if he could see the past materialized on the horizon. "Improper conduct," he repeated, with a faint, ironic smile. "So interesting how people can distort reality to protect their own failings." Charles waited, sensing that Walter needed to find his own words, his own rhythm to tell this story. "It was an autumn afternoon," the old man finally began. "I was pruning the hydrangeas near your father's office. The windows were open because of the unusual heat that day." He paused, taking a small sip of wine. "I didn't mean to listen. I would never do that deliberately. But the voices, they were hard to ignore." Charles felt a tightness in his chest, sensing what was coming next. "Your father wasn't alone in the office," Walter continued. "There was a woman with him." "It wasn't your mother." Charles closed his eyes for a moment. Part of him wanted to interrupt Walter, to say he didn't need to hear anymore, that the past should stay in the past. But another part, perhaps the braver part, knew he needed to face this truth. "At first, I tried to move away, to continue my work in another part of the garden," Walter went on. "But then I heard your name mentioned. They were arguing about you." "About me?" Charles couldn't hide the surprise in his voice. Walter nodded, his gaze now directly on Charles's eyes. "The woman, I never knew her name, was pressuring your father to leave your mother. She said they could start a new family, that you would eventually adapt." Walter paused, as if weighing how to continue. "Your father replied that you were not an important consideration in the decision, that the important thing was to protect the business, the Spencer family's reputation. A divorce would be scandalous, damaging to business relationships. You were mentioned only as a logistical detail." Charles felt as if something cold and heavy had settled in his stomach. He had always known he wasn't his father's priority. Richard Spencer lived for business, for the expansion of the financial empire he had built. But to hear that he had been discussed as a logistical detail was painfully revealing. "I didn't realize your father had seen me through the window," Walter continued. "I only noticed when, the next day, he called me into his office. He didn't directly mention what I had heard, but he said he no longer required my services. When I tried to argue, to mention my years of dedication, he was ruthless. He said if I caused any trouble, he would make sure I never worked on any prestigious property in the city again." Walter sighed, a heavy sound of resignation. "I had a young daughter to raise, Elena was only 5, and my wife had recently passed away. I couldn't risk it, so I left without saying goodbye to anyone, not even you, Charlie. That was the hardest part. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with restrained emotions. Charles felt a turbulent mix of feelings: anger at his father, sadness for the loss Walter had represented in his childhood, shame for never having questioned the official story. "I didn't leave the mansion by choice, Charlie," Walter concluded, his voice now firmer. "I was sent away because I overheard your father talking to a mistress. He realized it and didn't want me around. He preferred to get rid of me to protect his reputation." Charles was silent for a long moment, processing everything he had just heard. The image he had of his father, a brilliant businessman, a ruthless strategist, someone he had always tried to emulate in his own career, now shattered, revealing a man capable of great personal coldness and injustice. "I'm sorry, Walter," he said finally. "You didn't deserve that, and I missed you a lot, even if I didn't know how to express it at the time." Walter reached out his hand, briefly touching Charles's arm. "I'm not telling you this to make you think badly of your father, Charlie. We all make mistakes, make choices we later regret. I'm telling you this because you have the right to know the truth. And because—" he hesitated, choosing his words carefully, "because I see in you a struggle that I recognize. The struggle between becoming what is expected of us and discovering who we really are." The words hit Charles with an almost painful precision. Wasn't that exactly what he had been experiencing these past few weeks? This division between the ruthless businessman he had built over the years, following his father's model, and something more authentic that was beginning to awaken in contact with Walter, Clara, and Elena. "I've become a lot like him, haven't I?" he asked softly. Walter didn't answer immediately, considering the question seriously. "You inherited his intelligence, his determination, his ability to lead," he said finally. "But I also see in you a sensitivity that your father never allowed to flourish in himself. I see it in the way you treat Clara, how you respect Elena, how you've dedicated yourself to helping an old gardener without expecting anything in return." Charles felt something warm and wet in his eyes, tears he didn't allow to fall. "There's still time, Charlie," Walter continued gently. "There's always time to choose a different path." Charles nodded slowly, unable to speak. Walter's revelation had shaken something fundamental in his understanding of himself and his family. It was as if a crucial piece of a puzzle had finally found its place, allowing everything else to fall into a new configuration. "Did you ever tell anyone about this?" he finally asked. Walter shook his head. "What for? It would only cause more pain. Your mother probably already suspected. As for you, you were just a boy. It wouldn't have been fair to burden you with it." Charles thought of his father, who had passed away 7 years ago. Richard Spencer had died as he had lived, working, closing a big deal from his hospital bed, more concerned with the ongoing corporate merger than with his own mortality. His last piece of advice to his son had been about stocks and investments, not about life or happiness. "He never changed," Charles commented, more to himself than to Walter. "And to the very end, business always came first. Some men don't know how to change," and Walter replied, "or they're too afraid to try." When Eleanor and Clara returned a few hours later, they found the two men still on the balcony, talking quietly. The subject had shifted to lighter topics, but something fundamental had been altered between them. A painful truth had been revealed, a burden shared, a new understanding established. Clara ran to hug her grandfather, then Charles, excitedly sharing details of the party. Her eyes shone with the typical excitement of a child, and her joy was contagious. Charles watched how Walter transformed in his granddaughter's presence. Weariness replaced by genuine enthusiasm, the melancholy of the previous conversation giving way to an affectionate interest in every detail of Clara's story. "Mr. Charlie, are you staying for dinner?" Clara asked hopefully. "My mommy said she was making pasta, and I helped pick the sauce at the market. Charles exchanged a quick glance with Walter, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "I'd love to, Clara, if it's no trouble." "It's never any trouble," Elena replied with a sincere smile. "You're practically family now." The words, spoken casually, hit Charles with unexpected force. Family. A concept that, for him, had always been more theoretical than practical. The Spencers were a lineage, a name, a company, not a family in the affectionate, everyday sense he saw in that small apartment. That night, returning to his penthouse, Charles couldn't sleep. He stood on the balcony of his luxurious apartment, watching the city lights below, reliving the conversation with Walter, examining his own life from a new perspective. He realized, with a clarity that was both painful and liberating, that he had followed in his father's footsteps in more ways than he cared to admit. He had not only inherited the business, but also the hardness, the coldness in personal relationships, the willingness to sacrifice genuine human connections in the name of professional success. How many people had he pushed away over the years to protect his interests? How many relationships had he sacrificed at the altar of his ambition? How easily had he justified ruthless decisions with the cloak of business necessity? But something was changing. The weeks spent with Clara, Eleanor, and Walter had awakened something he thought was dormant forever: his capacity to genuinely care, to form bonds based not on interest or advantage, but on sincere affection and mutual respect. He looked at the city skyline, the sky beginning to lighten with the first signs of dawn. There was a choice to be made. He could continue on the path he had trodden so far, safe in his fortress of success and loneliness, or he could venture into unknown territory, where absolute control gave way to vulnerability, where authentic human relationships replaced strategic alliances. For the first time in many years, Charles Spencer felt truly in command of his destiny. Not because he controlled a financial empire, but because he recognized that there was still time to walk another path, to be more human, just and present. The path that Walter had shown him so many years ago, among rose bushes and lessons in patience, and that Clara was showing him now, with her disarming sincerity and her infinite capacity to love. Charles woke up on Saturday morning with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. For weeks, an idea had been taking shape in his mind. Initially just a fleeting glimpse, then a recurring thought, and finally an unshakable certainty. The conversations with Walter, the time shared with Clara, Eleanor's quiet dedication, all of it had led him to a decision that paradoxically felt both bold and absolutely natural. He had consulted lawyers, checked the finances, evaluated options, but most importantly, he had listened to his heart, something he hadn't done in so long he had almost forgotten what it felt like. The next morning, he drove to the Kowalskis' apartment with a folder of documents on the passenger seat. When he arrived, he found the family gathered for Saturday breakfast. A little tradition he had discovered was sacred to them. It was the only day Elena didn't have to rush to work, when they could sit together without being in a hurry. Mr. Charlie. Clara was the first to notice him, running to open the door with a radiant smile. She was wearing flannel pajamas with cloud and star prints, and her blonde hair was messy. "Did you come to have breakfast with us? We have pancakes." Charles smiled, feeling that now familiar wave of affection that Clara's spontaneity always awakened in him. "Pancakes sound great," he replied, entering the now familiar apartment. "But actually, I came to talk to you about something important." Elena looked up from the table she was setting, a slight worry crossing her face. Walter, sitting in his usual armchair with a cup of tea in his hands, watched Charles with a scrutinizing gaze. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Charles said, suddenly aware that he had arrived unannounced. "Not at all," Walter replied. "You're always welcome, Charlie. Any time." There was such genuine sincerity in those words that Charles felt a lump in his throat. This, he realized, was the true privilege his wealth had never afforded him, to be truly welcome, wanted for who he was, not for what he possessed or represented. "I have something important to share with you," he announced, sitting at the kitchen table at Eleanor's invitation. Clara immediately took the seat beside him, curious as always. "Is it a surprise?" the girl asked, her blue eyes shining with anticipation. "In a way, yes," Charles admitted, smiling at her before turning back to Elena and Walter. "Over the last few weeks, I've been thinking a lot about the future, about what really matters." Walter nodded, as if he understood exactly what Charles meant. "You welcomed me into your home, into your lives, with a generosity that transformed me," Charles continued, choosing his words carefully. "I want to give back in some meaningful way." "You've already done so much for us, Charles," Elena intervened, her voice soft. "My father's treatment, the small improvements to the apartment." "That was just the beginning," Charles replied, opening the folder he had brought with him. "What I have in mind is something more permanent." He took out some photographs from the folder and laid them on the table. They showed a two-story house with a small front garden located in a quiet residential neighborhood. It wasn't an ostentatious mansion, but a spacious and welcoming residence, with the kind of timeless charm Walter would surely appreciate. "This house," Charles explained, as the three of them examined the photos with expressions of surprise, "is 20 minutes from here. It has 4 bedrooms, a backyard garden, and it's 2 blocks from an excellent school for Clara." A thick silence fell over the kitchen. Eleanor looked from the photos to Charles, an unasked question in her eyes. Walter slowly put down his cup, his expression unreadable. Clara, for her part, seemed simply amazed by the images. "It's so pretty," the girl whispered. "It looks like a house from a fairy tale." Charles smiled at her before continuing. "I bought it last week, and I want to offer it to you." Eleanor gasped, bringing a hand to her mouth. Walter sat up straighter in his chair, his eyes fixed on Charles. "Charles, this is," Elena began, her voice trembling. "A new home," Charles completed simply. "A dignified place where the 3 of you won't lack for safety or comfort." "We can't accept something of this magnitude," Elena protested, although her eyes betrayed an internal conflict. "It's too generous." "It's not generosity, Eleanor," Charles replied sincerely. "It's recognition, appreciation. You gave me something that no money can buy. You gave me back a part of myself that I had lost." Walter watched Charles intently, a deep understanding in his gaze. Besides," Charles continued, taking more documents from the folder, "this isn't all I had in mind." He placed official papers on the table, neatly organized. "I've established an educational fund for Clara," he explained, feeling his heart race with the significance of what he was doing. "It will ensure she has access to the best possible education, art classes, music, languages, whatever she wishes to explore, and in the future, it will fully cover her university studies at any institution she chooses." The silence now was absolute. Eleanor had tears in her eyes. Walter seemed momentarily speechless. And even Clara, usually so talkative, watched the scene with a seriousness beyond her years. Charles looked directly at Clara, feeling an almost overwhelming emotion as he spoke the next words. "Clara will have access to everything she deserves. I will guarantee her education through college. I want her to have opportunities that I failed to appreciate in the past." A tear silently rolled down Elena's cheek. Clara, only partially understanding the full meaning of that moment, but sensing its importance, got up from her chair and spontaneously hugged Charles, her small body conveying a pure joy that no words could express. "Thank you, Mr. Charlie," she said, her face radiant with a luminous smile. "Can I have my own garden? Grandpa said he would teach me how to care for roses like he taught you." Charles hugged her back, feeling a lump in his throat. "Of course you can, Clara. The garden will be all yours." Walter reached his hand across the table, holding Charles's with a surprising firmness for someone in his condition. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His eyes, tearful but dignified, communicated everything. Gratitude, pride, a deep understanding of what this gesture meant not only for his family, But for Charles himself, it was a silent thanks, more eloquent than any words could be. "I don't want you to think of this as charity," Charles said, feeling the need to clarify. "I think of it as family, as belonging." The word family hung in the air, charged with meaning. For Charles, who had grown up in a house where relationships were defined by obligation and appearances, finding a true family connection in that small apartment had been a transformative revelation. "The house is ready for you to move in whenever you want," he continued after a moment. "It's already furnished, but of course you can change anything you wish. I want it to be truly your home." Elena finally found her voice, though it was still thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you, Charles. This is beyond anything we could have imagined." "You don't need to thank me," he replied simply. "You gave me something far more valuable than a house or an educational fund. You gave me a second chance to be the person I was meant to be." That morning, as the autumn sun lit up the small kitchen, something profound and significant changed in the lives of those 4 people. For the Kowalski family, it was the beginning of a new life, full of possibilities and security. For Charles Spencer, it was the culmination of a journey of rediscovery, not just of the boy he once was, but of the man he had finally chosen to become. When Clara insisted that they all have breakfast together, celebrating what she called the happiest day, Charles realized he had found something his father, with all his wealth and power, had never managed. A place where he truly belonged, not because of what he owned or had achieved, but simply for who he was. Spring arrived with an explosion of color in the garden of the Kowalskis' new home. Roses of different varieties, including the Alba Maxima, which Walter had insisted on planting, formed a vibrant carpet that could be seen from the street. Tulips, daffodils, and lilies completed the scene that, in just a few months, had become the talk of the neighborhood. Mr. Kowalski's garden, as the neighbors called it, was admired by all who passed by. Few knew that the hands that created that beauty were the same ones that, decades ago, had designed and maintained one of the most prestigious gardens in the city at the Spencer Mansion. 6 months had passed since the family moved into the new house. 6 months of adjustment, discoveries, and above all, happiness. Walter's health had improved considerably. The fresh air, the pleasure of tending to his own garden again, and the absence of financial worries had worked a miracle that medicine alone could not have achieved. Elena continued to work at Le Chateau, not out of necessity, but by choice. "I need to maintain my independence," she had explained to Charles when he suggested she could quit her job. "I want Clara to understand the value of work, not just money." Charles had deeply admired this decision, recognizing in it the dignity that had always characterized Elena. Clara flourished like the plants in her grandfather's garden. At her new school, she excelled not only academically but also in arts and languages. Twice a week, she had piano lessons, an instrument she discovered she loved. On Sundays, she spent hours with Walter in the garden, learning about each plant, each flower, each cultivation technique, absorbing knowledge that spanned generations. As for Charles I, the transformation was evident to everyone who knew him. In business circles, there was talk of his new approach, more balanced, less ruthless, yet curiously more effective. Spencer Investments was thriving like never before, now with a philosophy that valued not only profit, but also the human impact of every decision. Henry, his loyal assistant, was the first to notice the change. "You seem different, sir," he had commented once, after a meeting where Charles had turned down a highly lucrative deal for ethical reasons. "Different how?" Charles had asked, genuinely curious. "Lighter. More. Happy." Charles had smiled, offering no explanation. How could he explain that his life, once measured in acquisitions and professional victories, now found its true meaning in the simplest moments, like Sunday afternoons, which had become sacred in his schedule? No work commitment, no business emergency could interfere with the time he spent with Walter, Elena, and Clara. These were moments of simple joy, board games that Clara loved, and at which she became surprisingly competitive, quiet conversations with Walter about books and gardening, or simply watching Elena prepare a meal, occasionally offering help that she accepted with a patient smile at his lack of culinary skill. Charles, who once lived immersed in spreadsheets and financial reports, now found himself learning the Latin names of plants with Walter, helping Clara with her math homework, or simply listening to Elena tell stories of her childhood in Poland. These moments, so ordinary for many, were precious discoveries for him, small windows into a world of genuine human connections he had ignored for decades. One day, during one of these Sunday visits, Charles found Walter sitting alone on the porch, contemplating his garden with a serene expression. "Hush, do you know what I like most about this garden, Charlie?" the old man asked when Charles joined him. "What?" "That I don't have to worry about what will happen when I'm no longer here," Walter replied with the tranquility of someone who has made peace with his own mortality. "Clara will continue to care for it. And you will be here to guide her when needed." Charles felt a lump in his throat. The implicit trust in those words, Walter's certainty that he would remain a part of this family's life even after the patriarch was gone, was a priceless gift. "I'll always be here," he promised, and he knew it was a promise he would keep. On a particularly pleasant afternoon, while Walter napped in his favorite armchair on the porch and Elena organized photo albums in the living room, Charles was helping Clara with her science project, a detailed herbarium that combined art and botanical knowledge. "Mr. Charlie, what do you think of this leaf? Did the watercolor turn out well?" Clara asked, showing a page where she had painted the leaf of a maple tree with surprising accuracy. "It's perfect," Charles replied sincerely. "You have a special talent, Clara." The girl smiled, pleased with the compliment, before turning her attention to another sheet in her sketchbook. "So I made something special," she announced with an air of mystery. "Close your eyes." Charles obeyed, smiling. These little games and surprises were part of the routine they had developed. "You can open them now." When Charles opened his eyes, he saw a new drawing by Clara before him. It wasn't part of the herbarium, but something much more personal. It showed 4 figures holding hands in front of a house with a colorful garden. Clara, Eleanor, Walter, and Charles himself, all smiling under a big yellow sun. At the top of the page, in carefully drawn letters, it read, "My family." Charles felt something tighten in his chest, that emotion that was once so foreign to him, and which he now recognized as deep affection. The simplicity of the drawing contrasted with its emotional complexity. There he was, Charles Spencer, included without reservation in the family circle of these extraordinary people. "Do you like it?" Clara asked, watching him with those attentive blue eyes that seemed to see far beyond the apparent. "It's the most beautiful drawing I've ever seen," Charles replied, his voice slightly choked up. "It's for you to keep," Clara explained, "to put in your office, like the other one I gave you, so you remember us every day." The mention of the first drawing, the one Clara had given him saying it so you don't forget us, brought back the entire journey of the past few months. How that simple piece of paper had been the beginning of a transformation that not even the most visionary of businessmen could have predicted. Charles looked at Clara's expectant face, suddenly realizing everything he owed to this child. Without her improvised translation that night at the restaurant, without her disarming honesty and her infinite capacity to love, he would still be trapped in the golden prison he had built for himself. Crouching down to be at her eye level, Charles felt an emotion so intense he could barely contain it. His eyes welled up, something he would have once considered an unforgivable weakness, but which he now accepted as part of his rediscovered humanity. "I'm a better person, because you came into my life. Thank you, Clara," he said in a soft but firm voice. Clara, with the inexplicable wisdom that sometimes appeared in her comments, replied simply, "You were always good, mister." "Charlie, you just forgot." The girl then hugged him with that spontaneity that only children possess. Charles hugged her back, feeling a gratitude impossible to express in words. The next day, In his office at Spencer Investments, Charles contemplated the two drawings by Clara, now framed side by side on his wall. The first he made months ago showed three simple figures under a tree. The second, more elaborate, depicted the new reality they had built together. Kurt Weissmann, the German investor who had inadvertently triggered this whole transformation, came in for a scheduled meeting. "New drawings?" he asked, noticing the frames on the wall. "Yes," Charles replied. "So from the most talented artist I know." "Your daughter," Weissmann ventured, confused. Charles smiled, not correcting the mistake. In a way, Clara had become something very close to that. "Do you remember the girl who acted as interpreter that night?" he asked instead. Weissmann nodded, understanding dawning on his face. "The little translator, of course. An extraordinary child. More than you can imagine," Charles agreed. "She didn't just save our contract, she changed my life." Later, on his way home, Charles reflected on how something seemingly small, an interpreter who didn't show up for a meeting, could trigger such profound changes, a series of coincidences that, in retrospect, seemed almost planned by fate. As he passed the Kowalskis' house, he slowed down. He could see Walter in the garden, supervising as Clara carefully watered the rose bushes. Elena, on the porch, waved at him, inviting him to stop. Charles parked the car, feeling that now familiar sense of coming home. Not to the mansion where he had grown up, not to the luxurious penthouse where he lived, but to this simple place where he had found what truly mattered. His greatest achievement had not been the contract with Kurt Weissmann, but the love and humanity he had rediscovered alongside this unlikely family that fate had placed in his path. And for that, he would be eternally grateful to a little German translator, with messy blonde braids and the extraordinary ability to see the best in people, even when they themselves had forgotten that best existed.